You are a young woman in a steppe village when the thunder of hooves splits the horizon. Horses swarm like a black tide, yurts collapse under fire, and the cries of neighbors rise like smoke into the wind. Rough hands seize you, dragging you into a line where others already tremble. The air reeks of sweat, scorched wool, and fear so sharp it tastes metallic on your tongue. The soldiers' eyes are cold, calculating. They do not ask your name. Instead, they measure your body as if weighing livestock. Age guessed aloud, arms pulled to reveal strength, even scars traced with the curiosity of men appraising a horse's hide. Mothers clutch daughters. Children wail. You realize quickly here, humanity is irrelevant. You are an entry in a ledger, a commodity in a system larger than your life. Not wife, not daughter, not even prisoner. You are tribute. Pull back now. Genghis Khan's empire is celebrated as the largest contiguous domain ever built, stretching from the Pacific shores of China to the plains of Hungary. Historians praise its military brilliance, its swift riders, its iron discipline. But behind the triumph lies a silence, buried in chronicles and overlooked in classrooms, the systematic, disturbing sexual practices that turned conquest into an engine of terror. If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, pause for a moment, subscribe, share where you're watching from in the comments, and join us as we drag more buried truths into the light. Your voice fuels the unearthing of what history tried to forget. The Mongol Empire was not merely vast, it was seismic. From the 13th to the 14th century, it consumed nations, cultures, and millions of lives. Armies of mounted warriors brought cities to their knees within days. Yet what followed conquest was more chilling than battle itself: the deliberate, institutionalized exploitation of human bodies as instruments of control. Persian chroniclers like Atta Malik Juvaini and Rashid al-Din documented it. Chinese Yuan court records preserved it. Even European travelers, Giovanni de Pian del Carpine and William of Rubruck, left behind fragments that confirm the nightmare. These were not myths or isolated incidents. They were policies, enforced with ruthless consistency. And what you will hear next is not legend, but archival fact. The conquest never ended with swords or arrows. What came after was colder, quieter, and far more devastating. Once a city or village fell to Mongol arms, survivors were not left to grieve, they were processed. Chroniclers describe scenes resembling an auction ground more than a battlefield's aftermath. Men of fighting age were often executed outright, their blood staining the earth in quick rivers. The rest, women, children, artisans, were corralled into groups. The sorting began. It was methodical. Soldiers barked commands, pushing captives into lines. Girls were stripped of jewelry, sometimes of clothing, examined for signs of age and fertility. Old women were shoved aside, marked as useless, often discarded like husks. Young men too frail for soldiering were tethered together, sold cheaply, or left to starve. But it was the women of certain ages, 12 to 20, that drew the most attention. Chroniclers like Rashid al-Din speak with chilling detachment. The maidens were selected first, then divided among the commanders according to rank. The process was bureaucratic. Persian records note lists that survive in fragments: 50 virgins of age, 1517, sound condition, tallied beside bolts of silk and sacks of grain. Names were erased, replaced by numbers and qualities. Flesh catalogued as though it were timber. Mothers wept as soldiers pried daughters from their arms. In Samarkand, one witness wrote of 20,000 girls taken in a single sweep, their fates sealed not by their screams but by the ink of a quill scratching on parchment. And this was not chaos. It was systematic. Every officer knew his place in the hierarchy of spoils. First choice went to the Khan and his family. Next, to the Noyons, the generals who had delivered victory. Lower officers and loyal warriors received the remnants. Even common soldiers might be granted 1 or 2 captives as rewards, a grotesque incentive woven into the fabric of conquest. Transport was equally brutal. Captives marched in chains across vast steppes, forced to keep pace with herds of horses. Those who collapsed were beaten until they rose again, or left to die in the dust. Bodies of the fallen were stripped, sometimes of skin as well as cloth, then cast aside. In river crossings, rafts overloaded with captives capsized, Survivors clung to each other in freezing currents only to be cut down for slowing the march. Chroniclers remark that a 10 or 15% death toll was considered acceptable loss, no different from spoiled grain on a caravan journey. It was here that psychological warfare peaked. Entire villages surrendered not because they were militarily weak, but because of what they had heard. Rumors of what awaited the young women spread faster than horses could gallop. Mothers burned their daughters' faces with ash or knives to mar their beauty, hoping scars would make them unfit for selection. Fathers hid girls in wells or caves, sometimes smothering them in panic when discovery seemed inevitable. The Mongols cultivated this fear. Captives paraded before surviving townsfolk, stripped, chained, displayed as warnings. "This will be your fate," the message declared. And the villages opened their gates without resistance. Identity was obliterated as deliberately as flesh was consumed. Captives were renamed with Mongol terms, their birth faiths mocked in public rituals. Muslim girls forced to consume pork before being handed to officers. Christian women made to trample icons as a condition of survival. These humiliations were not accidents, they were policies. To own the body, one had to break the spirit. Chroniclers even note that resistance was met with collective punishment. Entire kin lines executed if a single girl refused to comply. Economics drove the system. Markets sprang up in conquered cities where captives were auctioned alongside cattle. Prices fluctuated wildly. In times of plenty, a maiden might fetch less than a horse. During shortages, she could be worth her weight in silver. Soldiers received bonuses for delivering virgins to higher officers. Commanders were evaluated not just by battlefield success, but by the quality of spoils they secured. Human lives became currency in the empire's economy of conquest. Archaeological digs in Central Asia have uncovered the remnants of makeshift holding pens. Stone foundations with markings suggesting restraint posts, designed to contain groups of captives awaiting division. These sites, stripped of ornament or comfort, were factories of dehumanization. Surviving accounts speak of the stench of fear, of children crying for mothers who would never return, of girls huddling together for warmth in the icy winds of the steppe night. And yet, even in this darkness, chilling precision reigned. Pregnancy cycles were tracked. Ledgers noted which concubines had borne children of Mongol blood and which had not. Those who failed were often discarded, cast into labor camps, or sold off. The empire treated the womb as both battlefield and breeding ground, measuring fertility like harvest yields. Rashid al-Din, writing in the Ilkhanate court, remarks on records of women who bore sons to the Khans, their names preserved only as mothers of princes. They existed not as individuals, but as vessels of lineage. This was industrial-scale dehumanization, executed with the same efficiency that made Mongol armies feared on the battlefield. And as the empire expanded, so too did the machinery of sexual exploitation. From China to Persia, from Russia to the Middle East, every conquest brought new waves of captives into the system. Generations grew up under its shadow, shaping cultures in ways still visible today. Entire regions altered marriage customs, pushing girls into wedlock at younger ages to shield them from Mongol raids. Communities scarred daughters deliberately, hoping mutilation might save them from selection. But there was no true safety. For once the machine of empire turned its gaze upon you, there was no appeal, no mercy. You were processed, catalogued, consumed. If the sorting fields and forced marches were the first stage of the Mongol system, what came next was its entrenchment, the normalization of horror until it became as ordinary as tax collection. The empire's leaders understood that terror alone could win battles, but to hold an empire, they needed structure. And so, sexual exploitation was not left to impulse, it was codified, ritualized, made into law and practice. At the highest levels, the Khans themselves turned concubinage into a cornerstone of power. Genghis Khan was said to have fathered hundreds of children, not by chance, but by design. Chroniclers like Rashid al-Din note that young girls from conquered territories were routinely selected for the Khan's harem, where their fates were sealed in silence. Some were elevated to positions of influence if they bore sons. Others vanished into obscurity, their names surviving only in genealogies as mother of prince. This was not intimacy. It was dynastic engineering. Commanders mimicked this pattern on a smaller scale. Victories were celebrated not only with loot and feasts, but with the ceremonial distribution of women. One account describes officers gathered in a great tent, captives paraded before them in rows, each chosen in turn according to rank. Those of lesser status waited nervously, knowing only the rejects would fall to them. It was a hierarchy that mirrored the battlefield itself. Loyalty and bloodshed rewarded in flesh. But perhaps most chilling was the way survivors were folded back into the machinery. Older concubines, or women who had lost their beauty, were sometimes tasked with training and selecting new captives. They became functionaries of their own torment, compelled to judge girls for qualities they themselves had once been judged upon. Survival depended on complicity, and complicity ensured the system endured. Chroniclers record instances where women, stripped of hope, coached terrified children on how to appear submissive, knowing defiance would mean death. Religion offered no sanctuary. In many cases, it became a tool of humiliation. Christian women were ordered to desecrate crosses before being claimed. Muslim captives were forced to eat forbidden foods, violating their faith as part of their initiation into bondage. These acts were designed not merely to break the individual, but to sever her from her community, leaving her spiritually as well as physically captive. To the Mongol war machine, faith was another weapon: conquer not just the body, but the soul. Public humiliation became entertainment and warning alike. In some cities, survivors recount women forced to dance naked before soldiers, mocked while their families watched. Defiance was punished with executions staged as spectacle. Entire groups of women were slaughtered before the eyes of other captives, a demonstration that resistance meant extinction. One Persian chronicle recounts a night in which 400 women of noble birth were executed for refusing the Khan's summons, an atrocity retold with admiration by Mongol chroniclers as proof of their master's absolute authority. Even justice was perverted. Within the empire, rape was not considered a crime against the victim, but against the owner. If a soldier violated a woman already claimed by a superior, he was fined or punished not for the act itself, but for trespassing upon property. In this twisted calculus, a woman's suffering carried no weight of its own. She was a commodity, her violation treated like damage to livestock. And still, the system was strategic. Raids were not random bursts of violence. Scouts mapped villages and towns months in advance, noting not just defenses, but the numbers of young women available. Campaigns were timed around harvests to ensure maximum supplies and maximum human cargo. Entire settlements were targeted specifically for the youth of their daughters. One European envoy wrote with horror that they reckon women among their spoils more highly than gold, for women multiply, but treasure diminishes. The consequences spread far beyond the captives themselves. Families fractured. Communities warped their customs. In many regions, girls were married off at impossibly young ages, parents believing that marriage offered the only shield against Mongol predation. Ritual scarring, binding, and disfigurement became survival strategies. In Russia, some villages tattooed young girls' faces in hopes of making them less desirable. In Central Asia, families broke their children's teeth deliberately, believing a ruined smile might spare them. These desperate acts reveal the depth of terror, the lengths to which ordinary people went to escape the gaze of the Khan's selectors. Yet the machine ground on. Archaeological evidence from Yuan dynasty China reveals administrative records where women were assigned not names but numbers, their fertility cycles tracked like harvest yields. The womb was bureaucratized. Pregnancy was proof of usefulness. Barrenness meant disposal. Chroniclers note chillingly that women who failed to conceive within a year were often sold off to labor camps or to lesser warriors as a kind of second-tier spoil. The empire measured human worth not in spirit, but in reproduction. This systematic exploitation reshaped demographics on an unprecedented scale. Modern genetic studies suggest that as many as 16 million men today carry markers traceable to Genghis Khan's lineage, evidence of the scale on which this sexual machine operated. Behind each of those markers are untold stories of women whose names were erased, their identities consumed by the empire's hunger for dominance. And the psychological scars endured long after the battles ended. Communities traumatized by mass abductions developed folklore of demon horsemen and night riders, spectral figures said to steal daughters under moonlight. These were not fairy tales. They were memory, encoded in myth, preserving the terror for generations who had never seen Mongol banners but lived in fear of their shadow. The system was, above all, systematic. It was not chaos, it was policy, it was bureaucracy. It was the cold efficiency of empire applied to the most intimate sphere of human life. And it worked, not just to gratify rulers, but to terrify populations into submission. Whole cities surrendered at the mere whisper of what awaited their women. Fear of sexual conquest became as sharp a weapon as any arrow, as effective as any siege engine. When the Mongols rode, they carried not just swords, but ledgers. And in those ledgers, lives were reduced to entries, dignity erased in ink. The numbers tell one story. Thousands processed in days, tens of thousands across campaigns. Entire nations bled of their daughters. But behind the numbers lie the silences, the names never recorded, the voices never heard, the lives never remembered. And it is in those silences that the true horror of the Mongol system resides. By now, the outlines of the Mongol system are clear sorting fields, forced marches, bureaucratic ledgers. But the most disturbing truths lie not in these first layers, but in what came next, the transformation of atrocity into a self-perpetuating machine. The Mongols were not content with seizing bodies. They sought to reshape them into instruments of empire. Chroniclers speak of harems so vast they functioned less as households and more as institutions. Within their walls, concubines were organized into ranks, each assigned duties according to favor, fertility, or age. At the top were the chosen, women who had borne sons or who pleased the Khan. Below them, layers of attendants, some forced to act as guards, others as tutors, others simply waiting for their turn to be summoned. It was an entire society, a shadow court built on captivity. Records note chilling calculations. Girls of 12 to 14 were considered prime, their bodies thought pliable enough to yield children quickly. Older women were relegated to menial roles or discarded. Pregnancy was monitored like agriculture. Rashid al-Din, compiling imperial chronicles, remarks that the Khans tracked their concubines as carefully as they did their herds, marking which bore sons, which bore daughters, and which bore nothing. The womb became empire property, fertility, a ledger entry. This logic extended beyond the Khans themselves. Commanders across the empire adopted the same system, filling harems and concubinage houses with captives. Archaeological remains in northern China reveal structures with hundreds of narrow chambers, interpreted by some as dormitories for concubines. Walls bore scratched marks, tally lines, perhaps left by women counting days, moons, or lost years. The silence of stone whispers what chronicles omit. But perhaps most perverse was the way victims were turned into agents of the system. Older concubines, stripped of hope, were tasked with preparing new arrivals, teaching them how to appear submissive, how to respond to summons, how to survive. In this way, trauma reproduced itself. Those broken by the machine became its gears, complicit by necessity, spreading their suffering onto the next generation. Chroniclers describe women coaching children as young as 10 on obedience, knowing disobedience meant death. Survival was purchased at the cost of another's despair, and it did not end in the private sphere. Public humiliation became a weapon of state. In some cities, captured women were paraded naked through marketplaces before being distributed among officers. These spectacles served two purposes: to reward victors and to terrify the defeated. European envoys report being forced to witness such scenes, the laughter of soldiers echoing as women sobbed under the gaze of strangers. It was conquest turned into theater, degradation into ritual. Justice itself was twisted to reinforce the system. If a soldier raped a captive already claimed by a superior, he was punished not for the violence, but for trespassing upon property. The woman's suffering carried no legal weight. She was an object, her violation meaningful only as theft. Mongol law codified what terror had already enforced, that the body was commodity, its worth measured not in dignity, but in ownership. And so the machine ground forward, relentless, efficient. It no longer required battlefields or sieges to sustain itself. It had become institutionalized. An empire not just of riders and arrows, but of ledgers, harems, and systematic dehumanization. The deeper one looks into the Mongol machine, the more chilling its logic becomes. This was not simply lust or chaos, it was strategy, a deliberate weaponization of intimacy. What made it most terrifying was how fully it was normalized, woven into the rhythms of empire, until it appeared as natural as collecting taxes or herding horses. Seasonal campaigns were not just about plunder or tribute. Scouts reported not only the size of walls or number of defenders, but the count of marriageable daughters within each town. Villages were mapped for their human cargo. Raids timed around harvests ensured that food and women alike could be seized in abundance. Entire settlements were spared destruction only to be stripped of their young women. In some cases, chroniclers note, commanders measured conquest not in gold or territory, but in the quality of spoils. An empire's worth quantified in flesh. Public festivals reinforced this order. Captives forced into degrading displays became part of victory celebrations. Soldiers drank, sang, and mocked as women were paraded before them, reduced to prizes of conquest. Executions of defiant captives were staged as entertainment, designed to sear obedience into all who watched. One chronicler records that whole cities bent the knee after hearing of the slaughter of maidens who resisted the Khan's bed. The lesson was unmistakable: surrender spared walls, but never the body. Religion, too, was conscripted into the system. Mongol leaders framed their dominance as destiny, sanctioned by the eternal blue sky. Violations became not crimes but rights of power, demonstrations that the Khan ruled body and soul. In legal codes, rape was listed not as an offense against a woman but as damage to property. Fines were paid not to victims but to owners. By such reasoning, atrocities were not only permitted, they were legitimized. What emerges is a picture of systemic exploitation functioning on the scale of empire. Chroniclers in Persia describe entire caravans of women transported across steppes, guarded like treasure, parceled out to officers as rewards. Archaeological evidence reveals holding complexes near Karakoram and other capitals, where captives awaited selection. Ledgers that survive from successor states list concubines alongside livestock and silk, proof that the system was as bureaucratic as it was brutal. The normalization of horror seeped into conquered societies. Parents, faced with unbearable choices, mutilated or even killed daughters to spare them the fate of concubinage. In some regions, girls were hidden in burial pits or disguised as boys, but discovery was common. Stories of night riders, demons on horseback who stole daughters beneath the moon entered folklore across Asia and Europe. These were not legends born of imagination, but cultural memory transmuted into myth, and perhaps most haunting is the realization that it worked. Whole populations submitted in terror, cities opened their gates at the mere rumor of what awaited their women. The Mongol war machine did not rely solely on arrows or fire. It relied on the whispered certainty that surrender was survival, and that resistance would mean a fate worse than death. Pause and consider: an empire, the largest the world has ever seen, sustained in part by this systematic violation, this industrial-scale dehumanization. It was not accident. It was not excess. It was policy, calculated and enforced, generation after generation. This was the true climax of Mongol power. Not just the conquering of cities, but the conquest of flesh, of dignity, of memory itself. The Mongol Empire is often remembered through the lens of glory, swift cavalry that reshaped continents, a genius of strategy that stunned even its enemies, and trade routes that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. But history, when stripped of its gilded edges, reveals something darker. Behind the brilliance was a shadow, a systematic exploitation of human bodies, a machinery of sexual conquest as deliberate and ruthless as any battlefield campaign. What makes this history so unsettling is not merely the scale of the suffering, but the way it was normalized. Chroniclers recorded these acts with the same detachment they used to describe taxes or livestock. Archaeologists uncover holding pens, ledgers, and foundations that testify not to chaos but to order, an order in which women and children were processed, catalogued, and consumed by empire. These are not legends. They are facts, preserved in ink and stone. And the echoes remain. Modern genetic studies suggest that millions today carry traces of Mongol bloodlines, silent witnesses in DNA, to a history few dare to speak aloud. Folklore across Asia and Eastern Europe still whispers of riders who came at night, of daughters taken and never seen again. These stories, passed down through generations, are cultural scars, reminders of how deeply trauma embeds itself when horror is turned into policy. But remembering is not only about horror, it is also about restoring dignity. The women erased into ledgers were not just entries on parchment. They were daughters who once laughed, mothers who once sang, communities torn apart by fear. To speak their stories now, even centuries later, is to deny erasure, to drag their names back from silence. Civilizations rise and fall, but what they choose to normalize tells us who they were. The Mongols built the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. They connected continents, transformed trade, and redefined warfare. Yet their dominance also rested on the systematic violation of the most intimate human bonds. Power unchecked turned intimacy into terror, love into strategy, life into ledger. If this history stirs you to vigilance, to curiosity, or simply to reflection, join us. Subscribe, share where this struck you hardest, and stand with us as we unearth the next buried truth. Because the past is never silent, it whispers in bloodlines, in folklore, in forgotten names waiting to be remembered. And in remembering, we honor not the conquerors, but the conquered.